Hello, and thank you for joining us for the virtual launch of Professor Henrik Schoenefeldt's book, Rebuilding the Houses of Parliament, which explores the fascinating history of Parliament's architectural design, the impact the environment and climate control had on its construction, and some of the key players who shaped the look of the building as we know it today. The book has already received acclaim from academics, architects and politicians, some of who we'll be hearing from over the course of the evening. But first, let me introduce our esteemed panel for the event. I'm joined in the studio by the author himself, Professor Schoenefeldt, and on the line, I'm delighted to say, we have got architect Anna Joint and former director of the Palace of Westminster Restoration and Renewal Programme, Dr. Richard Ware. Thank you all for being part of tonight's event, and all of you watching at home can also get involved in the proceedings by sending in any questions or comments via the YouTube and Facebook live stream sidebars. You can also use the hashtag Disruptive Environmentalism on Twitter. We'll put all those to our panellists later on. If you're interested in purchasing Professor Schoenefeldt's book, there is a special 25% off discount code, and further details will appear in order for purchasing that in the live stream sidebar. So let's begin, of course, with the author himself, Henrik. So tell us a little bit about the title and a little bit about what to expect in the book.
Yeah, I mean, the title has, I guess, this provocative phrase in it, Disruptive Environmentalism. And why I've chosen that title is because it tells us something about this building being actually challenged by new ideas of environmental control that reshape the building, because we know that the architect Charles Barry and the architect Augustus Pugin, who actually developed the initial design, and they were the key player in really shaping the architectural vision. But 5 years after our original architectural competition, we had the new players coming on board whose main concern was about the environment of the building. In this case, in the environment, we're talking here about the ability to ventilate it, climatically control it, provide a perfect environment for its inhabitants, in this case politicians in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And his involvement after 5 years of architects working on the plan was disruptive in two ways. And one of them was physical, because those environmental ideas started to shape the architecture in an unintentional way. So the architects had to adapt to embrace these new challenges of reshaping this architecture, accommodate these new requirements of ventilation. And also they had to adopt new working practices. In this particular, the role of environmental experimentation, which is something that Reid, as a scientist, so the protagonist, David Boswell Reid, the scientist was in charge of the ventilation, he introduced new ways of thinking and working design solutions. And they were different to the way the architects were approaching it. So, and that was another disruption, because the architects had to adapt the way they were working in order to accommodate those new working practices into their design.
And you've focused on some of those, like you said, some of those areas of disruption. How groundbreaking was all this level of disruption and the disruption made by all of those players that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly unique in the sense that these principles of ventilation, using towers, for instance, to drive air through buildings, also this idea of climatic control, which was not just heating, but also ability to cool and humidify the atmosphere. So it's an early form of air conditioning. Those techniques existed, and they have been sort of trialed at small scale only in horticultural contexts, for instance, glass houses and so on. But what's really unique to the buildings to apply them to the largest public building ever constructed in Britain at the time, and realizing that at scale and in a building that was for human habitation. And so that was groundbreaking in terms of scale and the complexity of it being integrated into building. And of course it was disruptive because the design of the building was developed before those ideas were started to be integrated into it. So there was a rethinking of the original architectural scheme in the light of these new requirements. And so that leads us to this idea of collaborative working in architecture practice. That's something that we use to today. Architecture practices today are very cross-disciplinary inherently, including the architects work on the current restoration is a cross-disciplinary design team who in order to solve those complex problems. And Barry was in some ways pioneering those ideas of a cross-disciplinary ways of working, where it's not just the architect and maybe a structural engineers working together, but there was suddenly this environmental specialist who was brought into the conversation around the design of buildings. So that was the project was sort of pioneering new ways of working in that sense.
And talking about cross-disciplinary, let's bring some of our guests in. Anna, let's come to you first. As an architect, looking at Henrik's book, what are your thoughts on the book?
Well, it struck me that it was an incredibly human and visceral description of the physiological effects of the architectural environment. I mean, architects kind of these days actually don't get so close to them. We leave those aspects to environmental engineers. That's part of the cross-disciplinary. But this description there's a lot of data to deal with in the book, but it's such a kind of wordy and very human description of the effects of a building. It was really enjoyable. Architects kind of look at the visual rather than the other senses, and the sense of kind of how the body reacts in a building it came across really strongly. I really enjoyed it.
And Richard, as someone who's been engrossed in the building in question, what takeaways did you have reading the book?
Well, I think the the thing that strikes me most of all is just how timely Henrik's book is, because we're just approaching now a really fundamental renovation of the Palace of Westminster. It's desperately in need of a full restoration and renewal, and because of that, we're going through a phase of really intensive research of trying to understand what we've got. And how it worked, and what its condition is, and how it's used now, and how it's going to be used in the future. So Henrik's work makes a huge contribution to that understanding. But it's also timely because we're challenged with trying to use less energy to ventilate the palace. It's been incredibly hungry of energy for about the last 100 years. We've been using mechanical ventilation of various systems, and from that point of view, it's a bit of an environmental disaster area. So we're challenged by that. Again, this book has something to say to it. And then the one that we couldn't really have foreseen a couple of years ago, but we're all thinking again about the connections between ventilation and public health. And that's something that comes very clearly out of the book as being Reid's preoccupation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A really timely piece of literature at this really historic juncture with the pandemic in question. Anna, I want to come to you a little bit later on to talk about conservation, because I know that's your area of specialty. But Richard, just sticking with you, you touched on it there, some of the themes. What do you think for a layperson like myself reading this book, what do you think are going to be some of the themes that are going to really, you touched on some of them there, but some of the themes that are going to be really hit home and be quite eye-opening?
Well, I mean, the history of the House of Commons in the Palace is one of difficulty about ventilation, as it happens. I mean, it was a huge issue before the fire in the old chamber in what is now St Stephen's Hall. So that theme of how do you manage a building that is so intensively used, that so many people pass through, it's the working environment. And I mean, in the chambers, you can, if you follow the chambers on television, you see this great fluctuation of people coming and going. And so trying to maintain an atmosphere in every sense that is conducive to political dialogue has always been, the dilemma at the heart of managing the building. So, and always will be, probably. So, I think that's part of it. And the other thing is, of course, the great difficulty that Reid and Barry had in actually turning their ideas into reality. And that's a whole other history. It's been well documented elsewhere about just how difficult a project it was. There were just so many actors and so many stakeholders and so many opinions about how it should be done. You really have to admire the people who struggled and, like Barry, eventually found a way through it.
And we're going to move on shortly to talk about some more of the topics of the book. But Henrik, just going to you before we go to a short video break. Writing this book, what were as a writer, what were some of those challenges that it posed to get across hundreds of years of story and quite complex architecture? What were some of the challenges of condensing that and getting that across to readers?
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember the book is outcome of 10 years of research. It's essentially research I've done since arriving at Kent, since leaving Cambridge, finishing my PhD. And it was the first project I started. And it coincided with just those early inquiries that took place in Parliament, Richard Ware is very much aware of, because we met quite early on in the process, talking about the possibility of a project being embedded in Parliament. So there's essentially the task is of essentially reconstruction environmental history is that you have to study thousands of documents, and very often documents that are not very often of interest to historians, interestingly. There are administrative files which might on the surface might appear rather dull and uninteresting, but they give us that intimate insight of the environmental reality of the building. And that is something I'm very interested in studying and tracing down those documents in various archives around the countries that give us actually that intimate insight into what people were actually thinking about the building, those who were occupying it, alongside those more the formal documentation like Hansard, which are recording debates, which are much more accessible, and which also gives us an insight in what the lords were openly saying about how they experienced the building. So it's that environmental dimension requires you to actually work with a much wider variety of documents, historic documents, particularly if you're thinking about the building before the lived experience, because some of my research I'm doing now is actually engaged with members directly through interviews and so on. So we can get the experience now through doing face-to-face interviews with individuals now. But if you're looking at the history of the environment experience, you really rely on personal accounts, which is sometimes in letters, sometimes in oral statements and lectures people have given, a variety of sources that you can then use. And then there's measurements, which gives you but insight into the actual physical reality and what they actually were. So one can see what shaped those experiences at the time. So, and I think that is, I would say, one of the challenges, bringing together this plethora of different documentations together through the focus of the environment, because the environment enables me to actually stitch together this variety of sources into a meaningful narrative, because that gives you the focus. It's the environment, being about the climatic environmental history of the palace, that gives you the focus to making sure that that huge range of documentation actually remains a focus.
Well, a wealth of documents. This one, a very worthy one to be added to that. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the book and some of the topics shortly. But we're going to move on now to hear the first of 4 pre-recorded testimonials about Henrik's book. We're going to start with Professor Dean Hawkes from the University of Cambridge, who's written the book's foreword and gives an overview of the themes and stories Henrik's written about.
I'm delighted to contribute to the launch of Henrik Schoenefeldt's book. At the beginning of the 19th century, the new sciences and technologies that came from the Industrial Revolution were brought to bear on conditioning the environments within buildings. For the first time, it became possible to conceive of buildings that were to some degree liberated from the limitations of the natural climate. It could be made warm in winter, ventilated when the air was still, and made light after dark. As cities grew in size, buildings of many types, often designed by leading architects of the time, embraced the new environmental technologies, fundamentally to transform the very nature of architecture. The most significant building project in Britain in the 19th century was the rebuilding of the Houses of Parliament, following the destruction of the earlier building by fire in October 1834. Henrik Schoenefeldt's study of the building that is the subject of this book is the outcome of 8 years of research, with access to the most comprehensive archival sources and, crucially, to the innermost recesses of the building itself. He's pieced together an account of the process by which this remarkable building was conceived, developed, and inhabited in the years following its completion in 1852. There are 2 strands to the narrative. First is the meticulous reconstruction of the design of the environmental systems of the building, as these evolved in a complex interaction with the overall architectural conception. Second is the account of the relationship between the architect, Sir Charles Barry, and Dr. David Boswell Reid, who was appointed as a consultant to advise on the design of a ventilation system for the building. These themes are equal in complexity and the book is compelling on both. The personal drama of Barry and Reid might almost be read as a Victorian novel. The Battle of John Dice versus John Dice in Dickens' Bleak House is brought to mind. But the account is in fact a fascinating and objective study of how the profession of architecture came to collaborate with the new force of environmental consultant, or ventilator, as we learn Reid was sometimes referred to. The building itself is, however, the central character in this wonderful story, and this is where Henrik's deep scholarship brings the greatest rewards. By providing key archival drawings from all the stages of the design's long development, and in his own beautifully drawn reconstructions of major spaces and systems, he illustrates and analyzes the building as never before. The project has become a central contribution to the ongoing program of restoration of the building, validating historical research as an element of contemporary practice. But for me, the overriding value of the book is in bringing into view the hidden wonders of the environmental systems of this great building, and thereby filling a significant gap in the environmental history of architecture.
Professor Dean Hawkes there with an abridged version of his foreword for Henrik's book. Now we're getting some questions coming in, so do keep them coming in on the Facebook and YouTube streams. We'll get those answered by our various panellists. We've had Rick has sent in a comment on YouTube saying, this book makes a significant contribution not only to the understanding of the Palace of Westminster, but to focusing on architectural history, on environmental performance. Henrik, what would you have to say to Rick's comment there about environmental performance at the House of Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what is important about the book is actually not just looking at how the original systems were designed, the process that led to its original conception, but it also looks into how the building had performed once it was completed. And this is actually a very central focus of this book. And this is actually quite what we might describe as a post-occupancy history of a building. So what happens to buildings once they are completed, and how effective were they? Did they meet those objectives that those designers had set out from the beginning? And this book shows that reality of those environmental conditions that those systems provide, and the challenges they encountered in the process, and the adaptations that were undertaken in the later stages of the buildings to improve the system, and by the 20th century also by leading it to being replaced with modern technology. So, and I think this point about post-occupancy is quite important to buildings, because it tells us really how buildings historically, how the environmental factors have actually shaped the building in its day-to-day operation, and also the way people were engaging with them in later stages of their life, of these buildings, to adapt them, to improve them. Where there was suddenly conversation about new technologies coming in, particularly in the 20th century. We have got mechanical ventilation, air conditioning technology, suddenly standing in competition with older techniques that were used in the building over the previous 90 years or so. So that is actually quite important when we think about historic buildings today, is that when we go into, for instance, the National Gallery, for instance, today, they are modernly serviced buildings. They're not serviced the way they were when they were originally built in the 19th century. So what this book does, it reconstructs not only the original system, but also the environment condition that it generated and how people experienced them. So that brings those buildings alive, in the sense that buildings are living organisms, and there's a continuous engagement with the environmental problems in buildings. And we see that even in contemporary architecture today. There's very few buildings are built today that actually perform the way they intended, and there's always some level of adaptation and improvement necessary. And the Palace of Westminster is quite honest in that say. There's an honest history of its performance throughout its lifetime, and how those performance were seen. How users were seeing the performance versus what the engineers and scientists were saying the performance of the building were. There was conversation across specialists and users. And that allows us to really bring alive that lived reality of the building.
Absolutely. There you go, Rick. So there's an answer to your question. And obviously, all of you watching on YouTube and Facebook, do keep your questions coming in. You can also tweet them with the hashtag Disruptive Environmentalism. We'll get those answered. Anna, coming to you now. Henrik talking there about some, how environmental factors affect a number of other buildings outside of Parliament. As an architect, what can you tell us about environmental factors and their influence on the design of a building like Parliament?
Well, all too often, the environment is changing for a start, and I suppose there's a big parallel between the leap that happened in the 19th century and the industrialisation and the sort of sudden onset of smog, smoke, and a very smelly river. So Reid and Barry were coping with a very different set of circumstances, a changed external environment, and trying to manage that, the internal environment. And we're facing the same sort of changes with climate change now. We need to catch up with a hotter, wetter external environment. And make our buildings comfortable to live in, to occupy. We need cross-disciplinary. We need to take on the environmental aspects as architects. We need to take them on absolutely initially at the very conception of the design. And it was kind of hilarious that Barry's design was completed with very little environment thoughts for the external environment initially, and then completely changed through Reid's involvement. So its external appearance with all those towers, those ventilation towers, it was completely different to the initial competition winning scheme. So yes, bringing in environmental aspects right at the conception is key, and we need to do that more than ever now.
Well, you set me up with my next question there. Whether it's pea soupers back in the Victorian era or climate change, the climate change challenges that we're facing today, there's that constant change in the environment that you're talking about. And I think in Henrik's book, one of the key things that comes across, and having spoken to Henrik about his research, is the application of the research and how it's taken on by architects and by users in the building. And I guess that kind of feeds into that idea that you said there about how important it is for architects and stakeholders to be involved in really early on taking those environmental factors into consideration at the conception stage. Is that something that you're seeing more and more now in the field of architecture, or is it something that is still a bit of playing catch up at the moment?
Well, for big schemes, you have to have a fully multidisciplinary design team on board at the beginning. Well, ideally you have, but often with kind of development, pressures of development, and to kind of get a scheme and some kind of idea of the financial viability of a scheme, you kind of do a quick scheme and don't take enough notice of the needs of environmental considerations, and then there needs to be a lot of changes after a later stage. It's often a function of needing to respond very quickly with a design and not taking environmental factors on board early enough, and then having to play catch up afterwards. So there's that as there's commercial pressures can drive things, and then you have to play catch up with environment afterwards. But also, I think that it's a rare architect who, I have to say, embraces environmental experimental environmental measures early on, because putting a building up is it's quite hard and it's full of risk. So one tends to go with tried and tested measures first, and it's a brave team and a brave client who will experiment. So this collaboration between Reid and Barry, and promoted and encouraged by MPs, particularly it was the House of, well, both houses encouraged experimentation. I mean, that was ambitious, laudable, and should be done more.
And you mentioned, and we've alluded to them a few times, the likes of Reid and Barry and all these personalities involved in Parliament. Richard, how much of an impact do they still have in their original designs? How much of a shadow does what they did cast on what has been ongoing with the Restoration and Renewal project?
Well, it's enormous, obviously, and we come across their legacy all the time, and I think the more we understand about what Barry achieved and what Putin achieved, and indeed Reid, that the more we are in awe of them, really. Quite early on in the process, Barry commented that he had no idea who his client was, because he had so many clients in both houses and various committees and in government, and we quote that and we think about that all the time today, trying to work out how can we navigate that problem. We've actually got legislation which went through in 2019 now to establish who is the client. We've got a sponsor body established by statute to deal precisely with that problem. Barry didn't have that, but he got there in the end despite it.
Yeah, it's absolutely it's a fascinating period of history as we read in the book, and as you've obviously spoken about at great length on KMTV, Henrik. Now remember to keep your questions and comments coming in for our panel. We're getting a few more in which we're going to answer shortly. You can send those in, like I said, on the live chat sidebars on whichever stream you're watching on. Like I said, more from our panel in a moment. But first, here's Columbia University's Professor Barry Bergdahl with his perspective on architectural history.
It was fascinating to read Professor Schoenefeldt's book and to encounter one of the major monuments that any professor of architectural history teaches his or her students from a different perspective, revealing a completely rich new story about the evolution of that building, but also one that challenges larger concepts of how we think about the evolution of architecture in the modern period, we might say since the Industrial Revolution. As detailed as Schoenefeldt's account is, because the history is epic and intense, I think even the non-architectural reader will find this account fascinating, because in the end, it is a history of a long-term experiment, and the book itself is an experiment in how we might write histories of buildings and histories of users of buildings, which suggests the complexity of building modern buildings from different expertises is part of Schoenefeldt's account of the emergence of the dialogues of expertise that are needed to create a major public building in the modern period. Most fascinating, I would say, in conclusion, in my admiration for this extraordinary work of scholarship, is Schoenefeldt's own experimentation with, we might say, resolving the bifurcation between the history of architecture and the history of science, are not in total conflict, but in fact often in dialogue. So the whole way that we've thought of this building as the exact opposite of the rise of functionalism, let's say in British factories of the early 19th century, is in a sense challenged by Schoenefeldt's extraordinary research and argumentation. And finally, I should say I admire very much the way in which he reveals to us that to study this history and to understand its full complexity, something made possible by the incredible completeness of the parliamentary record, is not simply an arcane exercise in understanding the first half of the 19th century, but rather is relevant to our own period, in which, once again, there's vigorous debate and vigorous experimentation on what is the relationship between the design of buildings and the creation of environmentally responsible places for work, particularly in relationship to our environmental crisis. So this is an extraordinary documentation of a dialogue, sometimes productive, sometimes tense, as I've said, between the science of building the science of the communication of a function, the Houses of Parliament, but also the science of creating an environment in which parliamentary debate could take place. So my congratulations to Professor Schoenefeldt and wishes for a very productive debate on this television program.
Barry Bergdahl there, talking a little bit about the relationship between architecture and science, and that ties in nicely with a question that we've got in on YouTube from Andy Greaves. Henrik, he said, congratulations on your book being published. Does this highlight the need of a mixture of architecture and engineering working in harmony?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because this is, like I said, a core of the theme of this book. But what I want to sort of highlight is, and I think Hannah alluded to that earlier in referring to contemporary practice, is that we actually not only got architects, engineers, but we also got a scientist involved, sort of building scientists. And what is actually very important, particularly thinking about buildings that were designed the way the Palace of Westminster was designed, is very different to when we think in particular modern buildings, with mechanically serviced buildings. They require very different skills than designing a building that uses principles of natural stack ventilation. Whereas actually very often the architecture itself is utilized in order to provide air movement within the building rather than mechanical technology. And why this is actually, I think, important is that sort of emphasis on the building physics. So when we are thinking about a building design where the architecture is doing quite a lot of the job of moving air around, using thermal convection in a building, using towers, is that requires a scientific skill and a scientific understanding, and then being able to apply that to a building, to a physical form, to find a form that enables those natural phenomena to happen within a building. Essentially, a building is trying to create an artificial weather, in a sense, in terms of movement, artificial winds, so using towers. And what is also important in the Palace of Westminster is that we got a physician involved. David Boswell Reid was trained as a physician, a medical doctor. And that is actually quite important. Not only did he have that scientific mind, so the familiar with the scientific methods, particularly the role of experimentation, but he also had the knowledge of understanding the environmental factors that affect us. So in terms of public health, so he had a very strong interest in the public health. In particular, was in the 19th century 19th century was an era of pandemics. We shouldn't forget that when we are currently in a pandemic. But in the 19th century, for instance, the cholera pandemic, and then later in the 20th century, we got the influenza pandemic with huge fatalities. So the Palace of Westminster was directly informed by those cholera pandemics, and there is theories that were informing design, and ventilation was a key measure of public health, because at that time it was believed that this disease was transmitted through the air rather than through water. As we know now, the cholera is actually through impure water. But that scientific understanding shaped the way he looked at architecture. And then he also has an interest in the thermal environment, what we today would call thermal comfort. So understanding scientifically what physical factors shape our sense of comfort in buildings. And this is very important in terms of a productivity in buildings. Our sense of well-being is actually strongly affected by the physical environment. Even in contemporary building is an issue. One of the post-occupancy evaluation of contemporary building, very often the discomfort is one of the top issues being raised by occupants. So that's sort of what we might describe as an occupant-centered focus in the building, where our needs, our health and our comfort are at the core. And that is the third pillar, I think, that emerged in the project. We had the architect, Charles Barry. He had an engineer within his practice called Alfred Meeson, who was a very strong character, very important character who might represent that civil engineering side of the project. But then we got the scientist who was adding on that third dimension, which is the environmental dimension, the human dimension, to the discussion. And they were in some ways complementing each other. In understanding that relationship between those three angles, that was the challenge, because that was so unique. Bringing those three dimensions of architecture into holistic design was the challenge, and understanding what the different working methodologies of each discipline were and how they could be integrated. That was a major challenge. And that way, it is, as Anna had alluded to earlier on with climate change, we need to sort of rediscover that. We need to rediscover new pillars in architecture, that making sure that the environmental dimension is brought into the core of the project. somebody would challenge us. Because in some ways, building scientists are challenging building services engineers today because they're asking us to look at buildings differently. They don't want us to see an environmental problem as a technical problem that can be just resolved through mechanical kit. But it's actually the architecture itself that has a responsibility to play. And this is something that's back to the architects. The architects need to think environmentally in their architecture rather than it being something you can delegate away to a mechanical engineer. So they need to work together. And the building scientist might again become a much more central figure in the way when we're thinking about designing sustainable buildings, because we want to do things with less technology, less mechanical technology that requires less energy, and therefore the fabric of the building, how we're designing openings in building and so on, materials we use and understanding their environmental properties. Just as Reid did. Reid had an enormous understanding of the properties of materials and also how environment affects us as human beings. And he also understood how architectural elements could be used as a primary means of achieving a controlled environment in the building, alongside, of course, mechanical solutions. They're working in tandem together. The building was literally a hybrid of mechanical engineering invention of the Industrial Revolution and these passive, what we today might describe as passive solutions that are of architectural nature and very human-centered.
And Anna, I saw you in my periphery nodding throughout that. And early on, when Henrik was talking about the microclimates that buildings produce, I found was incredibly fascinating and possibly links to a question that we've had in from Andy Scholes. He's asked, can modern engineering provide the technology to help make the building work as intended, to provide the right climate control for comfort within the architectural setting? Anna, when you put your when you peruse that and see that question as an architect, what would you have to say about that?
Well, wouldn't that be great if modern technology could succeed where Reid and then later Goldsworthy-Gurney failed to quite make the internal environment as comfortable as the occupants needed. I mean, it's terrible. It's what a triumph that would be if we could combine the sort of infrastructure that's been set up by Reid and Barry with all these potentially passive means of ventilating and heating and cooling the internal environment. But as Henrik's book describes the kind of army of people who were trying to control the environment, switching valves and communicating with each other, responding to complaints from the houses. And if modern technology could sort of do that in a highly responsive and efficient way, and through the way we now understand and can measure more accurately than they could in Victorian times, that would be amazing. I mean, just briefly, I loved the way they measured air currents with smell of orange and seeing when the MPs could smell orange or they could smell ether, and they could measure air currents passing through the chambers, or seeing where down feathers started to flutter when they were fixed to strings. I mean, they're so sort of empirical, so visual and olfactory, and all to do with the senses. But with modern methods of measurement, scientific methods of measurement, and all we have at our disposal now, it would be what a vision to be able to marry up modern technology and the infrastructure that's in the Palace of Westminster. That would be great.
It's fascinating, all those stories, and those experiments all sound a little bit like a Blue Peter experiment. Richard, with all the work that you've done on the Restoration and Renewal Project, you must have a few, stories about, some of those discoveries and some of those tales that Anna's just spoken about from your time on the project.
Well, lots of stories. I'm not sure I can tell them all. But what really fascinates me about this is that wonderful skyline, that silhouette of asymmetrical towers and turrets, which has gone around the world and is recognised all around the world. It says Parliament to so many people, and people love it, and they assume, and I always used to assume, that this was the product of Barry's neo-Gothic aesthetic in his imagination, but it turns out from Henrik's work that it's as much the product of Reid's engineering concept, even more, perhaps more so, than of what Barry intended. And I absolutely agree with what's been said about the way that architecture and engineering have to come together in the redesign for the future of the palace. That is happening. We've got a lot of very able engineers and architects working on the project, absolutely in tandem, and we'll get there, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we'll also get there with a couple of questions that have come in just after this short break. We'll be back for more chat. But first, here's McGill University's Professor Martin Bressani.
I'm honored and happy to be invited to say a few words about Henrik Schoenefeldt's new book on the rebuilding of the Houses of Parliament, and particularly, of course, the history of its ventilation. I consider it to be a major book of architectural history. In fact, I think it's an extraordinary book, which I'm convinced will constitute a landmark in the field of the history of architecture and the history of environmental system. It's a very detailed examination over a period of nearly 100 years of the development of the ventilation of the Houses of Parliament in London, with a focus on the early period when the architect Charles Barry and the ventilation scientist, we shouldn't call him an engineer, the scientist David Boswell Reid, sometimes together, the two together, sometimes separately, were devising the ventilation system for the Houses of Parliament. Henrik has produced, in my opinion, an amazing book for several reasons. First, I'd say it's an impeccable and thorough scholarship, something becoming increasingly rare of late. Henrik has spent nearly 10 years in the archives, which he analyzed scrupulously and in the most concentrated fashion. I think it's an extraordinary achievement on that ground alone. Also, I think it's an amazing book for the precise and economical writing style, another aspect that is rare in architectural writing. And finally, I think it's an amazing book because he's giving us simply an extraordinary story. A story narrowly focused on the design and construction of the ventilation system of the Houses of Parliament. But despite this narrow focus, and in fact, probably because it's such a narrowly focused and detailed, he's able to show how it intersects with a multitude of aspects of the Victorian period. So it's, of course, a history of the environmental systems, and especially a history of the competing systems of mechanical versus natural stack ventilation. It's also a detailed post-occupancy history of apartment buildings. So this is quite rare that architectural historians give a history of post-occupancy. Usually historians concentrate on the design itself, but they don't follow through after the design. And that's what Henrik has given us. And on top of it, he's giving us the history of post-occupancy evaluations themselves, because the Houses of Parliament are unique in that they've been always monitored after the design and construction. So it's a case where there was a post-occupancy evaluation, which is quite unique. It's also, he's giving us a managerial history of the construction of the Houses of Parliament. Basically, he sheds light on the administrative network for decision-making, which is extraordinarily complex. So we can get an understanding of how the Parliament building was designed, because of course it wasn't designed by one architect alone or one mechanical engineer. It was a whole huge network of people making decisions for the design of that building. In closing, I would like to address a very provocative statement with which Henrik closes his book, and I quote here, he writes, "The famous picturesque composition of the Palace of Westminster skyline, with its array of turrets, towers, and spires, was not driven by a grand architectural vision, but was an accidental outcome resulting from the need to meet the functional requirements of the ventilation system," end of quote. Here I will take issue with Henrik's statement, if I may. I do think that there was actually a grand architectural vision. I think it existed in Barry's mind, in the architect Barry's mind, and that he kept rigorously to that vision. it just so happened that that Gothic vision could not only accommodate all the new towers and flues that Reid was demanding, but that it could take great advantage of it. That in effect, Reid's ventilation requirements were perfectly attuned to Barry's Gothic vision. So the two, Barry and Reid, in the end, should really have gotten along much more than they did. Thank you very much.
Great to hear from Professor Martin Bressani there. On to some more questions from viewers. Rashid, we haven't forgotten about you. We have got your question here. One for Henrik. How is the architecture of the Westminster Palace related to how the palace is ventilated? Is there any connectivity? Well, we obviously focused a little bit on that, but what would you tell Rashid about the connectivity between how the palace is ventilated and the architecture of the building?
Yeah, I think I can give quite a short answer to that. I mean, I guess it has been alluded to by Anna earlier, saying that the towers, the towers that we see on the Palace of Westminster, they are actually an outward expression of the functional requirements of the stack ventilation system. So we're seeing it externally being reshaped. So these towers, actually most of these towers weren't there in the original architectural design. They were integrated into the design only at the point when these ventilation principles were introduced. So they were a direct result of those new requirements, successfully integrating the architecture, but the main driver behind them were these new functional requirements. And then we find internally within the building is that actually about a quarter of the entire internal space of the building is occupied by spaces to move and condition air within the building. So the walls are hollow, the floors are hollow, and they act as conduits of air. So this is what makes this building distinct from sort of modern buildings, where you've got metal ductwork in buildings that are separate from structure. The palace was constructed to contain voids. And these voids were used to move fresh air into the buildings from the basement and also extracted upwards through the roof spaces. So all the walls were essentially hollowed out to create those connections between each space. So the architecture was directly reshaped around those requirements.
Absolutely. Rashid, thank you for a fantastic question. Henrik, we've got another question for you from Joyce. She said, what are your top recommendations and strategies on meeting the challenging net zero carbon target by 2035 while modernising the palace?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because my interest, I guess if I'm to take it from there, is of course, we got technology. That's about the question about how we do regenerate energy in the future. But my actually interest in is not so much in the sort of technology that supports the building, that brings us the energy into the building, but it's actually how can we design the building by reutilizing those principles that could potentially be of very low energy solutions to addressing the problems of cooling and ventilation in the building. So in particular, if you think about net zero carbon in relationship to historic buildings, we need a new methodology. It is not possible to just apply the methodology we use in modern buildings to design the problems, but you need to actually work with the intelligence in the building. Because when we're thinking about historic buildings, they were designed with particular environmental principles in mind at the time. It's not that the Victorians didn't have any environmental thinking. Of course they did. Like every era had a particular paradigm of environmental control in the buildings, and it became increasingly more complex by the 19th century as more technologies evolved and became, by the 20th century, incredibly technological. So what I think what we can do with historic buildings is we can build on that understanding how the buildings were originally intended to work and use modern technology to engage with that. So that we don't expect modern technology to be retrofitted in existing buildings without an understanding how they were originally operated, but working with that synthetically. And through that, we have a real potential of making those buildings work environmentally much more robustly, and also with a much less requirement for energy to cool or heat or ventilate them.
And Anna, on the subject of conservation, your area of specialty, what happens if buildings like Parliament don't reach those carbon targets?
Well, historic buildings have a big advantage, that they have an enormous amount of embodied energy in them already. So they are kind of they are flying high in terms of net carbon zero. There are many ways that, in fact, on another strand of work, I'm looking at churches and how to go net zero carbon on those. And there are many ways of reducing a church's carbon footprint. There are offsets one can do if physical fabric methods don't work. You can usually get there, and with a historic building, you are well on your way because of all of this embodied carbon actually within the building.
We've got a couple of questions in from Simon Stanley on Facebook. Richard, I'm going to send these your way. The first one, are there any systems in the building that were originally installed which are still cutting edge to this day?
Certainly systems that are still working, even though they were installed in the 1880s. I'm thinking of the sewage system actually for the palace with a pump which empties the sewage from the palace into the metropolitan sewer, and that's a wonderful piece of technology which was innovative at its time, and it's still miraculously working today. So yes, I think there are examples of that. But I mean, in a sense, the elephant in the room, which we haven't mentioned yet, is that the palace is facing a crisis now because it's been underinvested for so long, and we haven't had a major renovation. We are relying on clever maintenance people and luck really to keep all these systems going. There hasn't been a major renovation since the immediate post-war period. So we're sort of living in the last chance saloon, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier on, we've now got legislation to frame the process, which has to come now of fundamentally restoring and renewing the palace. And at the moment we're in the phase of drawing up really detailed plans for the work that has to be done, so that can be costed, and then ultimately a budget can be set for it.
Well, with that in mind, can you give us a bit of a latest status report on that project? I mean, without going too political, do you think those users, the politicians, the clerks, everyone in there, do you think they fully appreciate how much of a crisis there is with the building?
Yeah, I think that is pretty well understood now, and it's understood across the parties and across the two houses. I mean, I talked to a lot of members in both houses, and they do recognise that something really has to be done. Obviously, it's a difficult time because it's going to be expensive, and that there's a lot of sensitivity about that. And however it's done, it's going to be highly disruptive to the work of Parliament, and that's difficult as well. So we've got more to do on that, and that's why, as I said, we're drawing up a detailed scheme at the moment of exactly what is essential to be done, how it can be done, what it's likely to cost. And the next step after that, which is laid out in the legislation, is that we have to bring that plan back to Parliament, expecting that to be in about 18 months' time, for Parliament to approve, because ultimately Parliament has to approve these plans and has to approve a budget. We can't do it otherwise.
And Henrik, talking about project governance, post-occupancy, and that engagement that Richard's spoken about with MPs and the Lords currently, one of the major themes in the book is the involvement in politicians in that original design. In what ways were the politicians involved in that original design, and how are they still involved to this day?
Yeah, this is actually, I think, very important to understand the way the building developed is that actually Parliament, so in the form of both houses, being involved in the design, even on those environmental issues. So there's something to remember, that these environmental issues were not a technical issue that was just concerned to scientists and engineers, but it's actually driven by members. So actually while the competition was held, the architecture competition, they had a separate select committee. So this was not a technical committee, it was a committee of politicians who were consulting experts, inviting experts to speak to them about what modern technology could achieve to address problems of ventilation, lighting, acoustics, climate control in the debating chamber and the wider palace. So they were seeking that sort of rather specialist knowledge because they thought that it was really critical. And then when they decided to have Reid on board, which was 5 years sort of after the competition, they actually had again Parliament involved in making a decision whether Reid's ventilation system should actually be integrated in the palace or not, because they had to sanction the funding for it. The Treasury had to provide extra funding to realize the system, because the cost of the system hadn't been integrated into the original budget. So they had to get that through Parliament again. So there were select committees that delayed the project for about a year in order until that decision was made by Parliament. So the politicians were actually very, very involved, both Lords and Commons, in those debates around how the building was reshaped around environmental requirement, why it was important, why to put extra towers on the palace and have to pay for it, why was it necessary, couldn't it not be avoided by putting other technology in the building. There was a long-standing discourse. So the politicians were involved directly in that, and then one needs to also understand once the building was occupied, and that's something that maybe links it back to the current situation, is that people are experiencing the environment of the buildings and were then actually be quite vocal about what they thought about how well the building was performing, and then again went forward and appointed new select committees to review the building's performance. This is very unusual to have a user of a building who was so actively involved in criticizing a building and even setting up its own committee to review them, getting experts from outside to give opinion on that and advise them on changes to improve it. And that thing, I guess, links us back to the Second World War, particularly when we're thinking about the bombing of the House of Commons chamber in 1941. There was a huge conversation around how should the chamber be rebuilt. Should it be following the historic model of the pre-war chamber designed by Charles Barry, or should it be a modern chamber? And the decision to then retain it in its original form didn't preclude the possibility of modern technology. So when they then rebuilt it, they had a conversation around should they reinstate the old methods of climate control, or should they go for the most advanced technology of its time? And they went for a solution that was using mechanical ventilation, air conditioning, that was cutting edge at its time in terms of its controls as well. So it was a highly sophisticated technologically, despite its sort of rather more historic appearance, the interior. Behind it, you had all the late 1940s most advanced air conditioning technology, and it was really cutting edge in Britain at the time. Air conditioning was something rarely used in buildings. When you find it in cinemas, you find it in hotel buildings in some cases. But actually to have a public building with this level of highly sophisticated environment control was really kind of statement. And when you look at the current the newspapers at the time, they were celebrating that to quite an extent. They're showing wonderful illustrated London News, showing us a cutaway, what is actually behind the scenes, behind that veneer of a 19th century interior, beautifully detailed. I really love the reconstruction. But behind us, that you got all that mechanical technology of its time, beautifully integrated with those intricate woodwork detailing of the chamber.
Well, all that sets us up nicely for our final pre-recorded testimonial. This from someone who sits in the very hallowed chambers of Parliament. Lord Norton of Louth has kindly sent in his thoughts. Here they are, and we'll be back shortly for our final panel chat of this evening.
This is a work of original scholarship that has clear relevance for the restoration and renewal programme of the Palace of Westminster. Much is known about the work of Sir Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin in the design of the Palace of Westminster. Visitors gaze in awe at the grandeur of the building, but this focus tends to overshadow the work of David Boswell Reid and the importance of the environmental design, dealing with such key issues as ventilation, air quality, and energy efficiency. Those of us who are contemporary users of the Palace of Westminster are acutely conscious of some of the problems arising from maintaining airflow and heating, and how the many flues are now used. The need to decant the palace for the purpose of the R&R programme becomes more essential with every passing day. This book draws out splendidly issues that have a current resonance and that need to inform the deliberations on the R&R programme, not least in terms of sustainability and low energy design. Such considerations have informed the construction of the new Welsh Senedd in Cardiff Bay, but that is a new building. The challenge is especially acute in restoring a Grade 1 listed building that is a World Heritage Site. Henrik Schoenefeldt has done a superb job of combining archival research with his professional expertise to produce a major work, rich in detail, analysis, and illustrations. It identifies the conflicts and challenges in designing the palace, and the extent to which the work drew on pioneering experiments, as well as the novelty of seeking feedback from users. The study is one that could not be better timed, identifying ways to proceed, as well as how not to proceed, as we move to restoring the jewel in the crown of this nation's parliamentary history.
Strong words there from Lord Norton, all ringing true. Questions coming in. We've got a second question in from Simon Stanley. Richard, I'm going to ask you this one. Parliament was built with several private homes within the building. Did the need for these homes and apartments influence the systems used to manage the whole site? Were they isolated or were they treated separately? And has the repurposing of the apartments over time affected the current management of the building?
Well, yes, and it's a very interesting topic, actually, because there were numerous apartments in the original concept, and almost every senior official of Parliament had to be given a house on site, as was thought at that time. And they're almost all gone now. The one that remains is the Speaker's house in the House of Commons, which is very largely used for ceremonial events and receptions and things like that. All the others have gone, and they've been converted into sometimes member offices, other facilities, and so on and so forth. But the legacy is very difficult because they were originally self-contained buildings and very often on different levels, which means that we don't, although the palace broadly has 5 floors, there are numerous ups and downs. As you walk around the palace, there are steps. And of course, for people with any difficulty with mobility, that is a real headache, and it's not something you would do in a new building, a modern building. You wouldn't be allowed to do it. So it's left us with that problem of trying to ensure step-free access around the building, and lots of other problems as well, because we have little narrow corridors that used to link bedrooms but are now major thoroughfares for members and staff and others trying to get from one block of offices to another, and so on. So it does need a bit of a rethink. And in the past, it's been done piecemeal, as each residence was taken away from the office holder who held it. It was converted over a long period of time, but never with any overall plan of how to do that. So it's another of the many headaches for the architects, yes.
And Anna, Richard said there a need for rethink. We've spoken about, and you mentioned earlier on the some of those experiments that take place. Some might say the architecture of the building is stuck in the past. That keeps Britain locked in those traditional ways. Is it perhaps time to maybe look at a new building for Parliament, designed from scratch, responding to ongoing climate emergency issues, something that's maybe more expressive of current Britain? Is Palace of Westminster a dinosaur, some might say?
Oh, it's such an incredibly significant building. It's a Grade 1 listed. It's a World Heritage Site, and so it's significant. It's a very beautiful building, but its significance lies in its use. That's the heart of it, and it's been in that use since it was built, and it's been adapted in these various ways that Richard has said, but it's kept going. That keeping a building in the same use as its original purpose for that long is one is a big part of its sustainability. It's one definition of sustainability. It's been an experiment through its life. And I don't think there's any reason at all, given the kind of, it's the great investment of research and energy that's gone into it, how much loved it is, that the experiment can't continue with this new project, the restoration and renewal, with the tools that we have today, and combined with Henrik's incredible research. I think that the hope, there's great hope that the problems of the building and the sustainability of the building can really come into its own now. And there's I think there's grounding modern technology and Britain's modern know-how with our heritage, and this fantastic building would be a great combination. Better than any new building, I would say.
And it's what's been really heartening in the book, and from talking to you, Henrik, about your research is, and we focused on it a little bit this evening, is people coming from across disciplines to contribute and to make that this great experiment work in the 21st century. Richard, how helpful has it been to you and to your peers to have academic research like Henrik's and applying it in practice, and as Henrik focuses on in the book, all of these various stakeholders involved?
Well, it's been incredibly helpful. I mean, as I think I said near the beginning, this has been a huge research effort to try to understand the building in all its aspects, historical, its condition, its use, and so on. And Henrik's contribution to that has been tremendous. So no, I'm lost in admiration really for what he's done. And I hope we'll continue this collaboration for some time to come.
Absolutely. I mean, Henrik, it is the culmination of a decade of research, or almost a decade of research for you. Tell us a little bit about some of those stakeholders that have been involved and some of those individuals you've engaged with over that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite an evolution, and this 10 years of thinking about research is what I really enjoyed about this project is that it actually has always been in dialogue. This research had always been in dialogue with this restoration program, starting off with Andy Piper and Richard Ware. So Andy Piper on the design side being involved. He's an engineer from background, but he's sort of really driving the sort of architecture side of it at the time, from the very beginning. And those people are actually been very, very important to me in helping and supporting me in that involvement and enabling it, actually. So that's when we talked about enlightened clients. So if we think about the sponsor board and the delivery authority being now in charge of the projects, so that we can really truly say they are enlightened clients in that sense that they recognize the value of this research and to enable this project to go ahead. And then having also the opportunity of being seconded into the program to actually lead research that enables me to study the building itself, but then also feeding that research directly into the design processes, working with surveyors, with the design team at BDP and so on, who are actually in charge of the design process, and having that sort of collaboration, I think is very, very important. I mean, to enable, to retain this building, actually. And the one thing I would really sort of say is actually when you think about conservation and about this question about, there's this question, should Parliament be vacating and moving into new building? There's a sort of big question, but I would sort of argue we need to come now in an age where we stop demolishing buildings, because we are currently in an age where we're seeing a lot of rather sophisticated 20th century buildings. We don't have agency. The problem is a lot of post-war architecture does not have the same fan club that we see with 19th century or earlier buildings. So we've seen those buildings being demolished because there's nobody speaking up for them. There are some societies that try to do that. So by saying we're sticking to this building and adapting it for the future, making it sustainable, we're making a big statement saying the only sustainable way forward is actually to keep buildings, not to demolish them, but to retain them and adapt them for modern use. And I want to just give one little historic example is, we're talking about democracy is changing. Modern 20th century democracy is not anything like 19th century democracy. The demand for MPs has changed fundamentally. And this has led to some significant changes around the parliamentary estate, like the Portcullis House, which is the centre now of the House of Commons, and where a lot of MPs have committees and their offices and so on, meeting the modern requirements. But everyone looking actually back in the 19th century, they had already a conversation about how could the building be adapted if maybe in the future we have a different type of debating chamber. That's always a question. Churchill in the 1940s wanted to retain the old chamber. It was a statement about Britain's resistance. It was a political statement towards the pressures of fascism, Nazism at the time. So it's very much very political context at that time, is saying that Britain was going to retain, it's going to reinstate itself the way it was, this distinctive culture of debate that's very adversarial in this chamber with two facing benches. But there were actually already in the 1860s and late 1860s, there was actually some dissatisfaction with that arrangement. The chambers were not large enough. There were also thought about could debates be administered differently in a different shape of chamber. And what they did actually propose several solutions of moving, creating a new chamber next to the old one in one of the courtyards that would have different shapes. Some were square, some were semicircular, some were circular. So they were really actually engaging about this question, how robust are historic buildings to adapt? So actually about thinking about historic buildings as something that might be obsolete, this notion that maybe buildings get obsolete and demolished. And there's something that we see in London all the time. We see 19th century warehouses being stripped apart from its facade and then a modern office building put behind. The carbon footprint of that no reconstruction is enormous. The embodied carbon in that steel structure that sits behind these facades. So by retaining buildings, as Anna has alluded to, I think one of the things about keeping buildings and making them work for the future is absolutely critical to the net zero carbon future.
Yeah, incredibly vital, and I think that's something that probably all panellists and many of our viewers would agree on going forward. And I think a really important point to end on, something to give our viewers food for thought, plenty of food for thought that you guys have all provided this evening. Thank you all very, very much for taking part. And sadly, we've come to the end of the launch. It's been great to have Anna, Richard on the line, and Henrik, of course, wonderful to have him in the studio. Many thanks to everyone who sent in their testimonials on the book, and a big thank you to you at home for watching and sending in all your fantastic questions for the panel. Remember, Rebuilding the Houses of Parliament is now on sale, and there is a special 25% off discount code. The link to buy is available in the sidebar. Well, that's all from us here. We hope you enjoyed this fascinating discussion and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.